Naperville was in the midst of a national story when local resident Brian Howard set fire to the Air Traffic Control Center in Aurora. Less than a month later, the facility is back to its normal routine. Naperville News Extra's Alyssa Bohenik has an update on the situation and more details about what happens in the air.
17 days, 20 racks of computers, 800 telecommunication circuits, 10 miles of cable, and countless hours of work is what it took to get things off the ground at the Chicago Air Route Traffic Control Center. Brian Howard, the man charged with sabotaging the facility, is being held without bond. He faces felony charges of destruction of aircraft facility that could bring a 20-year prison sentence and a fine up to $250,000. Despite the drama that occurred, what was most shocking was the amount of delays that unfolded following the incident, and why. Looking for answers, we spoke with local resident David Sapodin, a retired FAA traffic controller who worked at the center, and explains how airplanes are guided from sector to sector and the amount of data and communication that's needed.
If you can imagine a wedding cake, if you're at 17,000 feet or below, and you're about 30 to 40 miles radius of O'Hare, then the responsibility for your flight is being handled out in Elgin. As soon as the aircraft wants to get out of 17,000 feet, all the way up to the 40,000 and 40,000 feet and above, you're going to be switched to Chicago Center. And if you're going east, you'll be switched to a sector that handles east departures. If you're going south, you'll get switched to a sector that's handling south departures, and so on. So the flows of inbounds and outbounds are physically separated by low altitude sectors.
The Chicago sector handles 10 to 12,000 flights a day. With this amount of traffic, a plan must be in place in case communication was to be lost between facilities.
What are we going to do if Chicago Center goes away? How are we going to get the aircraft from the nearest center through our airspace, albeit vertically expanded from the norm? How are we going to do that? What routes are we going to use? What altitudes are we going to use? What frequencies are we going to use? They wrote all this down. You can't really practice it, because to practice it in the middle of a day shift would end up with what you saw what happened last Friday. Well, you can't actually do that.
The fire at the Aurora Center put into motion a contingency plan Sapodin helped create when he worked at the FAA.
The contingency plan called for all of those terminal radar approach control facilities to vertically expand their airspace from whatever it was they normally worked, or 10,000 feet and below, to up to 23,000 feet. And that the aircraft would go from one to the other, to the other, to the other, until it got to C90 and could talk to O'Hare and then talk to the tower and get down. Okay, but this would obviously slow things down. The people at those facilities would be working airspace they're not used to. They would be working airspace at high altitude that they normally don't, at speeds that they're definitely not used to.
Though the contingency plan was in place, it wasn't practiced. Yet Sapodin feels the plan worked well, getting flights back into the air.
Once these people were deployed, then the numbers really went up. So some of this I'm sure they came up with on the fly. That's amazing. They didn't have any warning that this was coming. You know, it's tough. I hope I've communicated somehow the complexity of what's involved and the amount of data.
Though flights were operational, delays remained, even affecting the president days later when he had to reroute Air Force One to the Gary Airport instead of O'Hare as previously planned. More questions arose regarding the security at the center and how Howard managed to cause such distress.
There is, of course, fences all the way around it, and there's a guard shack to get in that you have to go through. Now, if you were an employee of that facility and they recognized your ID card, you had to show it. You may have had to stop, but they didn't, last I remember, they didn't necessarily search your cars. They might want to actually have security inside the building.
Despite the troubles experienced all over the country, Sapodin is relieved the disruption occurred during a less active flight time.
It might be a wake-up call. You know, it was a terrible thing. We were fortunate this happened actually on a midnight shift before All the controllers had reported to duty for the day shift before the rushes had taken off from Midway and O'Hare. There were few aircraft in the sky. This may, in some forms, be a blessing for FAA and the government and Congress to go through how they want to approach these issues down the road.
I'm Alyssa Bohenick for Naperville News Extra.